Hi, I'm Roby, and for the last 55 years I develop educational projects combined with art exhibitions. For the moment I'm helping my friends with their Art for Children gallery and art lending in Da Nang, central Vietnam. We regularly receive questions from schools about aggressive behavior of children and what can be done about that. Although I'm not specialized in the field of aggressive behavior, during my study theory of education this was given a lot of attention, and later I also worked in an institution where children lived who were uncontrollable at home because of their aggressive behavior. Years later I was hired to develop an art project for the Amsterdam Children's Art Palace. It was located in the Amsterdam Bijlmer. There was a lot of violence there and also some death, and we had to prevent the new generation of children from going the same way with our activities. My task was to develop the theoretical base for the activities. In other videos I go into more detail about the activities I came up with and developed. I hope some of my ideas about this topic are useful for you, and you also can send questions or comments, of course. So whenever I bring this topic up to a wider audience, the question always comes up like, why do I think a banana stuck to a wall in a museum counter aggression when it actually make people a lot of angry? Well, I'm not going to avoid that question, but I'd like to start by explaining how we think our way of working with art helps children to react less aggressively. Let's give it a closer look. Well, you know, when a child is born, in addition to the child, a placenta also comes out of the mother, but unfortunately no manual. Art also provides no manual, but what art can do is help people understand some of the causes of aggressive behavior. In doing so, our vision is based on a few assumptions. The first is that no children are born with a bad character, but there is no manual, and the way we raise the children can produce good results for one child and the opposite for another. Why aggressive behavior develops strongly in some children and not in others is not always clear. Aggressive behavior does not just happen. There is also no moment when a child consciously decides to become an aggressive person. However, there is a very important aspect in which art can play a role, a preventive role. I would like to start by looking at the cause of some aggressive reactions, especially when it comes to defensive activity. We feel a threat, and aggression is one of the ways in which we can react. Not always immediately, but it can become a result. To understand why we can feel threatened, we need to look at what is important to us. The most important thing for us as human beings, as individuals, is it's not a family, but very primarily just breathing. You can't go 10 minutes without it. Then there is drinking and then eating. Parallel to this we have the feeling of security and the continuity of things going well. In order to be able to judge something, we need to be able to perceive it correctly. And do we see what we see? Well, one of our activities to teach children to look carefully at what we see. I have made several videos about it, so here's just one example. Are these two faces, or is it a drinking cup? And what about the penthouse staircase? Well, our perception is constantly developing from an early age, but has many shortcomings, some specific, some more general, but which there are two very important ones. And differentiating. We start with the latter, which is more or less the friendly form of discrimination. Discrimination is a word that has acquired a very negative meaning over time. But originally it simply meant making a distinction. And making a distinction is one of the first and most important things we have to learn. There's an incredibly amount of stuff coming at us, And we have to learn to distinguish between what is probably good for us and what's probably not. And often we have to decide this very quickly. Then there is no time to look at something very specifically. So we generalize certain important characteristics in order to quickly reach a judgment. The more knowledge and the more techniques we have can help us a lot with this. When crossing a road, there can be all kinds of traffic. We have to get to know the difference between cars and pedestrians. But we also have to judge whether they are moving or not. So as a child, I lived next to a forest with lots of wildlife, and at young age I was taught the difference between, for example, healthy blueberries and a very harmful deadly nightshade. As you can see in the pictures, they look a bit the same. Well, they look quite a lot the same. If you're next to each other you can see it easily, but when they're separate it's not that easy to see. Well, there is a certain order in which we learn to distinguish. We first learn which berries are dangerous and then which are not. It's not wise to start with the tasty and healthy berries, because when we see blueberries somewhere we automatically and unconsciously associate them with tasty and healthy. That's not wise if there are also poisoned blueberries growing nearby. And that applies to several things. So we first learn what poisonous mushrooms were and how to recognize them well, and only then what the edible mushrooms were. And if we are not sure, we should not eat them. Simply for safety reason, we already consider unknown things as dangerous. Later we learn that there are many exceptions, especially when something is often in view. It's important that you quickly learn to distinguish. But if this is not the case, we usually hold on to the prejudices, and that is certainly not good for us. Well, it's safe, but that's something else. And as you understand, when something is possibly not safe, we usually adopt a defensive attitude. The point is that those kind of prejudices are essential for our safety, but they also have an annoying disadvantage. Prejudices are mainly characterized by black and white thinking. It's either good or it's bad, and there are hardly any nuances. As a result, people quickly fall into what is known as discriminatory behavior, with all its negative consequences. It's interesting that when determining what is discriminatory, people proceed in the same way. Everything that is possibly discriminatory is already called discriminatory. So, however, it's almost impossible to make perfect descriptions. You can also see that in a country where freedom of expression is considered the most important right, people are still not allowed to use certain words. Discussions about those boundaries often lead to aggression. And here we already have a clear example of how art can play a special role in this. This is done by crossing boundaries with an open mind, not with the aim of crossing those boundaries, but with the aim of finding out at what moment a boundary is crossed. Artists have enormously important tasks in this, and those are two great examples of how art can be test boundaries. In the film Don't Burn, the American officer does something that is not allowed. But in retrospective, the enormous positive impact becomes apparent. He was with his unit during the American War in Central Vietnam. His people shot down a group of North Vietnamese dead. It turned out to be a doctor and her assistants. And it's also turned out that she had kept a diary. The standard rule was that it had to be burned immediately. The South Vietnamese interpreter and advisor who had started reading the diary told the officer that he absolutely could not burn this book. He stated this was such an incredibly moving document, and even though it was from his enemy, it had to be preserved. The officer did that for decades, even though he broke all the rules. Even though he made it the diary public, which had been translated in the meantime by his South Vietnamese sister-in-law, who initially refused to translate it until she started reading it. Anyone who reads the book understands what beautiful literature is, and rightly so that it was not burned. A compelling example of how art explored boundaries is the film Taking Sides. At the outbreak of the Second World War, many artists, often rightly, fled to America from where they could safely expose the atrocities of the Nazis. Wilhelm Furtwängler, the world-famous conductor, decided not to do this. He stated that if he went to America, his music would no longer be heard in Germany. And many people would find that terrible because listening to his music was often the only comfort they had left. And he did not want to flee his country at this time, and he wanted to do what he could. Now Furtwängler was not only popular with the general public but also with the Nazi leaders. Despite the fact that he refused to cooperate with the regime and always had Jewish musicians in his orchestra, he was regarded as a collaborator after the war, and the film is therefore about how the researchers treated Furtwängler like any other Nazi criminal. His Jewish research assistant find it appealing how disrespectful he treats the conductor, because for them too his music was what gave them hope. Also among the refugee artists there was a great contrast between those who thought he should have left and those who thought it was very courageous to stay. Interesting, the same film director István Szabó also filmed Mephisto, the book by Klaus Mann, 20 years earlier, a book on the same theme. Problem situations that arise due to the prejudices can be prevented mainly by good and timely information. Thereby one learns to apply that knowledge. This learning process is mainly based on communication. That is why I would now like to delve a little deeper into the aspect of communication. The principle of it is quite simple. Person A has a message for person B. In order to convey that message, it must first be cast in a form, often a language, that makes its convenience possible. Then a medium is used, which can be a letter or a video, for example. When B also uses that same medium, he can receive and decipher the message and possibly respond. So the principle is actually quite simple, but in practice this is not. It already starts with creating the message. It often seems so simple. Your partner goes to the store and you ask, "Oh, if you're going to the store, will you bring me some apples?" Okay, no problem. And then he stands in the store. But which apples are expected? Red, green, sour, sweet, small, big? And how much is what? And are those apples 2 apples or a kilo? How ripe should the apples be? Immediately edible or not? And apples are very concrete. How do you put your feelings into words? Well, given the numbers of poems and songs, this can be done in an infinite number of ways. After which it turns out that with one person the communicated feeling comes across in the same way, while with others it leads to a completely different conclusion and new stories. In short, shaping the message is already a huge job, and usually we only succeed in this to a limited extent. The choice of medium is also very important, and the medium we would like to use is not always available. Because of those limitations, even more of the original message is lost. Every step in the communication process means loss of the actual message. Well, it's clear that communication rarely goes smoothly. Fortunately, as we get to know each other better, we automatically correct these mistakes. Knowing better actually means that we can see the message as we think the other person intended it. In other words, that we can put ourselves in the other person's shoes and that we see the message through the other person's eyes. That putting yourself in the other person to look at what we see from their perspective is one of the most important aspects for actors. In his famous works, The Paradox of the Actor, that Denis Diderot wrote about 250 years ago, he stated that a good actor has no feelings at all. And that is why he can play every feeling perfectly, because he's not disturbed by his own feelings. And that's in principle also the situation how you can best look through the eyes of another, by, as it were, completely emptying yourself so that what you see is in no way influenced by how you think yourself. That is usually easier with people we know very well and who often think exactly the same as we do and come from the same environment as us. However, it only becomes really interesting when we could see through the eyes of someone we don't know or much less well. And that's essentially what art has to offer us. An artist has given shape to the message they want to convey in her or his way, in a very specific way. Of course, there are artists who claim that they don't want to convey a message and that they don't want to influence the other person. But the only way they can do is by doing nothing, because as soon as you make art and show it to another, you are communicating. In the distant past, before photography was invented, art had mainly a documentary function. But even then, a work of art was sometimes much more than a report. A good example of those approaches is the two-part work by Francis Goya, the 2nd May of 1808 and the 3rd May of 1808. The first painting is just a bit Rubenesque, a beautiful, vital representation of the fight against the Mamelukes, Napoleon's imperial guard. The second painting has much more depth for me, even though Goya does not take a clear position at first sight. For those who do not know that it was a Spanish resistance against Napoleon and that Goya was a Spaniard, it's not really clear whether the execution was justified or not. Nevertheless, Goya does in fact take a position, not only by depicting this, but also by the way in which the citizens are depicted in the background. It's interesting that when we search for the intention of the others, we start from oneself, from how we usually see things, and then we look at what we find of that ourselves in the other. What we are essentially doing is using our own classification system as a standard. We look for what is known to us. But with our activities, we want to teach children to look for what is unknown to them. And that is quite different, because in fact you can only remember what you know. Usually that is contained in our language, while there are many things for which we do not yet have words or no words. A nice myth is that of the invisible ships, which claims that when the European explorers, the ships approached either North America, South America or Australia, the appearance of their large ships was so foreign to the native people that they could not even see the vessels in front of them. A possible explanation for this phenomenon is that the natives obviously did not have binoculars, and they regarded the large unknown ships as distant mountains because that's what they most resemble, and they know mountains. Because we assume that you often learn to understand things by doing things, as a very old saying goes, learning by doing, we think that an active participation helps children to become familiar with things like looking carefully. And for us, it's not the end product that is important, but it is what you encounter on the way there that makes the activity interesting. The focus on the end distracts a lot from what you can encounter along the way. So in our activities, discovery is central, without passing judgment for good or bad. Learning to look analytical without immediately passing judgment, giving a valid judgment, having opinion is nothing more than putting something in a well-known box. The above represent our vision from which we work. We have also made several videos about those subjects, but in practice this vision is not so clearly present because for the children it is important that the activities themselves are fun and interesting to do. For the supervisors, this background knowledge is important. When the children have made something, we will only pay limited attention to the result, but we will have many questions about the creation in relation to our objectives. Our activities can be distinguished in the more passive enjoyment of art and the more active enjoyment of art. We have two important passive activities, and that is on one hand the exhibitions with work that fits well with the experience of children. This work is therefore hung on the eye level of children. This is an example of an exhibition about circular books. On one wall, all work from children books. One of the books, Moon Sun, from Lena Corrie and Le Touetrin, is about the theme day and night. So we made a bridge to Paul Cézanne works by showing how he was painting the same mountains on different days in day and night. Why it is important that we have work that is made for children or goes well with children is just because when you go to a museum and you see artwork, we always want to feel familiar, somewhere at home at the museum. When everything is strange, then you also feel like a stranger, and it's very difficult. But when you come in a museum and you see things you know, style you know, other things, then you feel already at home, and it's much more easy to also to enjoy the new things. And that works the same for children. So on the other hand, we have the works in the children's art lending, just like in a library. Children can rent works of art from us for free. The idea behind this is that you get to know a work more and more when you see it more often, and also in all kinds of emotional states. When you wake up, when you go to sleep, we are all different. On one wall of the gallery is where children can hang their own selection of the children's art rental. And it's interesting to see what kind of works the children pick up. And even the very young one, they often take works that I think, hey, this is funny. So the activities in which the children are much more active, and they are very diverse. Our curator Gulia develops them. In essence, it's about learning and discovering by doing. In the near future, we will make videos in which we let Gulia speak for herself, and in which she shows how she develops her activities and what are the laying goal. By the way, that does not have to be the same as the activity, the goal. The goal does not have to be the same as the activity. For example, when you make a nice party card with stamps, the children are mainly concerned with that party. However, making a stamp means that what you cut away, you cannot stick back on it. And that's a very important thing. So you have to look carefully before you cut. And that can be the activity that we find interesting to teach them, at least for those who are open to it. Using art to stimulate certain behavior requires that children find it fun and interesting to be involved with art. So we focus very much on that. In addition, we are part of a society with our activities and not next to or above it. Children are very sensitive to that. When it's New Year's or Teacher's Day, we go along with that with an adapted activity. For other days, the children were making cards using all kinds of techniques and a lot of fantasy. And they love to show Gulia proudly what they have made. What we are definitely not is an art academy for children. We teach them to enjoy art, and it's useful to know how things are made. At an art academy, children learn how to make things over a long period of time. We help children to understand how art is made, but we also develop activities in which we use art to stimulate language development. But we have other videos about that. It's a good reason to subscribe to our channel. So you can also keep up to date with our activities by our website or Facebook, Facebook is very popular in Vietnam, so that's why we use it. And now about the banana. Of course, it doesn't work by saying, oh, it's art and that you have to understand art. For some reason, people usually think that art should simply be understandable. On the other hand, for example, someone buys a simple kitchen utensils, they get a whole manual book with it, how to use it and how not to use it. And art is no different. You can say it's just a banana stuck to a wall with tape and millions are paid for it. I wouldn't talk about that like that. But it's a free will that somebody pays so much for it. And they don't pay for that banana or the tape, but for the manifestation. And of course also the underlying idea of the tourist. How and why did they come up with this idea? The problem is that we tend to confuse economic value with artistic value. What people's reaction will be if the artist had stuck the banana to the wall, but then had put a price tag on it saying from 3 million, now only for 250 euros. Such a statement would have been understood and mostly likely also found funny. The group that now finds it bad that so much money goes to a banana because they suddenly call it art would probably have reacted very differently. Instead of talking about what the banana costs, they will have talked about what the artist actually meant with his banana action. So we'll understand that he wants to address the fact that those banana plantations are terrible. Others might think that the original banana looks completely different. This is a degenerated banana. And yet another that the banana stands for a very healthy and good and cheap, but so much art actually costs far too much money. It's a very interesting discussion. But is the situation of art so unique? Well, I don't think so. We have the same discussion about sports. Suppose I happen to kick a ball. That's nothing special and people will not see this as sport. Because it's fun to kick a ball, I do it more often. At a certain point, even once a week with friends, and now we play against another group, it's still not a sport, more an activity. Until we decide to participate in a regional competition, we do not earn anything with it, and at that point it becomes an amateur sport. Some of our team are very good and are asked to join a professional club. Are there already professional athletes or still amateur athletes? Eventually they pay full time and thus become professional athletes. But there's still a big difference between professional athletes in the lower regions and top athletes. This is also very noticeable in the salaries, just like with art. When it is an amateur art and when it's just art, it's all very vague. Top salaries in sport can also be absurdly high. And you could say that those investments are more clearly based on performance. That is true. But on performance in the past, a top athlete does not suddenly get millions because he did so well last season. People pay so much in the expectation that he will possibly do even better in the future. But how long does such an athlete last? All kind of things can happen with works of art too, but generally less than with top athletes. For both, some institutions or people are willing to pay a disproportionate amount of money. This added value is completely dependent on the market value and has nothing to do with the sporting or artistic value. That is why I rarely want to have a discussion about certain art is worth because the value has nothing to do with the artistic value, but with the market value, and those things have little to do with each other except that they have an influence on each other. In the case of the banana stuck to the wall, it's also interesting because the banana has already been central to such a discussion. In 1966, Andy Warhol came up with his banana, and Warhol said, "Art is anything you can get away with." It's a good idea. The banana graced the cover of the debut album of the Velvet Underground. Great album. Warhol was already famous for his vision and approach to art and the Campbell cans. He said, "You need to let little things that will ordinarily bore you suddenly thrill you." And that's what Warhol showed, that when you just look carefully at common things, sometimes they become special. And in fact, it's not that strange because my father used to work for Unilever as an artist. He designed the letters and the package. And when you see how a designer is working, how it is, for me it's art. To say, yeah, but it's not free art, and then I think, who cares? It's art. Well, Warhol sometimes is called the king of pop art, but we also find that attention for the ordinary work of Man Ray, who made the ordinary so absurd that it aroused both aversion and enthusiasm. His iron from 1921, exhibit under the title Gift, was immediately stolen, as if it were a banana stuck on the wall. Speaking of communication and pushing boundaries, these are very excellent examples. And when I visited a Man Ray exhibition about 50 years ago, I was particularly struck by the fact that no one was bothered by the work, but was always pleasantly surprised with each new work. And by the way, about the iron, Man Ray came from a family of tailors. And there an iron was not just an iron, it was incredibly important and central in the business. And when you happen to see it, it's quite funny. But when you know the background, it suddenly gets a whole different meaning. That by making this iron so useless, he takes a distance from his background. And it's often the layering and the beauty of absurd art. So I thank you for watching this video. I have hope for my next video my voice will increase a little bit, I'm sorry. But it comes with the age, I think. See you in the next time.